Most Americans grow up hearing about the Second Amendment, but very few are ever taught where it actually came from, why it was written the way it was, or what assumptions already existed before it was put on paper. What we're told today is usually simplified, modernized, and filtered through current political arguments. What almost no one does anymore is go back and read the material that explains the mindset of the people who created it in the first place. That's what this video is about. This isn't a debate video. It isn't about modern policy preferences, party politics, or culture wars. It's about historical context. Specifically, it's about what the founders believed before the Bill of Rights existed, and how those beliefs shaped the Second Amendment as it was later written and ratified. To understand the Second Amendment honestly, you have to understand the assumptions behind it, not just the sentence itself. The best place to start is not the Bill of Rights, but the Federalist Papers. These essays were written in 1787 and 1788 to explain and defend the proposed Constitution to the American people. They were not written to justify the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment didn't exist yet. That's exactly why they matter. They show us what the founders already believed about arms, militias, and liberty before anyone thought it necessary to spell those ideas out as amendments. One of the most important things most Americans are never taught is that the Federalist Papers assume an armed population as a baseline condition of a free society. The authors did not argue whether the people should be armed. They argued about how a free government could exist because the people already were. That distinction changes everything. Let's start with the concept of the militia, because this is where much of the modern confusion comes from. Today, many people hear the word militia and imagine a small, organized, government-controlled force. That is not how the founders understood it. In the late 18th century, the militia meant the body of the people themselves, capable of bearing arms. In Federalist number 29, Alexander Hamilton discusses the militia in clear terms. He explains that the militia is drawn from the people at large and that the goal is for them to be properly armed and equipped. This is not presented as a radical idea. It is presented as a practical necessity. Hamilton's concern is not whether citizens should have arms, but how to ensure they remain capable and functional. Hamilton writes that little more can reasonably be aimed at than having the people properly armed and trained. That line matters because it reveals the underlying assumption. Arms in the hands of the people are normal. They are expected. They are foundational. The militia is not a substitute for an armed population. It is an expression of it. This ties directly into another fear that runs throughout the Federalist Papers, the fear of standing armies. The founders had lived under British rule, and they understood firsthand what permanent professional armies could become when separated from the people they governed. Standing armies were seen as a constant temptation for abuse of power. Hamilton repeatedly warned that standing armies are dangerous to liberty. He argued that one of the best ways to avoid the need for a large standing army was to maintain a capable militia composed of armed citizens. In other words, an armed population was seen as a safeguard against the concentration of military power in the hands of the state. This fear was not unique to Hamilton. It was widely shared across the founding generation. Multiple state constitutions and declarations of rights at the time explicitly warned against standing armies in times of peace. These were not fringe views. They were mainstream political beliefs rooted in recent historical experience. Another key figure is James Madison, particularly in Federalist number 46. Madison addresses concerns about federal overreach and the possibility of tyranny. He compares the American system to European systems and explains why tyranny is harder to impose in the United States. His reasoning is direct and unapologetic. Madison writes about the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. This is one of the most quoted lines in Second Amendment discussions, and for good reason. Madison is not talking about sport, hunting, or recreation. He is talking about political structure and deterrence. He explains that an armed population, combined with state governments and local institutions, creates multiple layers of resistance to centralized power. This layered system makes it far more difficult for a tyrannical government to take root. Madison contrasts this with European nations, where governments were afraid to trust their people with arms. What's important here is not just what Madison says, but what he assumes. He assumes that Americans are armed. He assumes that this condition exists before any conflict arises. He treats it as a fact of life, not a privilege granted by government. Madison's argument is not a call to violence. It is an explanation of deterrence. The idea is that liberty survives because power is checked before it can become abusive. An armed populace makes tyranny harder to impose in the first place, reducing the likelihood that force will ever be necessary. Alexander Hamilton addresses this issue even more directly in Federalist No. 28. Here, he discusses what happens if government becomes abusive and betrays the people it represents. His language is careful but unmistakable. He acknowledges that there exists an original right of self-defense that precedes government itself. Hamilton describes this right as paramount to all positive forms of government, meaning it exists above and before man-made political systems. This is a natural rights argument. The right to self-defense is not created by law. It is recognized by it. Hamilton also explains the dangers of waiting until it is too late. He describes scenarios where people are forced to rush to arms without organization or preparation, leading to chaos and suffering. His point is not that this outcome is desirable, but that it is precisely what should be avoided through proper structural protections. One of those protections is an armed population that does not have to scramble for permission or capability in moments of crisis. Again, the assumption is clear: the people already have arms. The question is how to preserve liberty so that those arms never have to be used in desperation. This brings us back to the broader fear of standing armies, which Hamilton discusses in multiple essays, including Federalist Numbers 8, 24, and 25. Across these writings, the message is consistent. Standing armies concentrate power. Concentrated power threatens liberty. An armed populace acts as a counterweight. The founders believed liberty required balance. They built a system of checks and balances into the Constitution, but they also understood that structural safeguards alone were not enough. They believed that the character and capability of the people themselves mattered. This context is essential when we talk about the Bill of Rights. Many people ask why some Federalists initially resisted adding a Bill of Rights at all. The answer is often misunderstood. It was not because they opposed individual rights. It was because they believed the Constitution already limited federal power sufficiently. In Federalist No. 84, Hamilton argues that listing specific rights could be dangerous if it implied that the government possessed powers it was never granted. He worried that written exceptions could later be used as pretexts for expansion of authority. Whether one agrees with him or not, this argument shows how seriously the founders took the concept of limited government. Ultimately, political reality prevailed. The American people demanded explicit protections, and the Bill of Rights was adopted. When the Second Amendment was written, it was not inventing a new right. It was formalizing assumptions that already existed throughout the founding era. When you read the Second Amendment in light of the Federalist Papers, its structure makes sense. The reference to a well-regulated militia reflects the belief that the militia is drawn from the people. The protection of the right to keep and bear arms reflects the assumption that this right already exists and must not be infringed. What the Federalist Papers do not say is just as important as what they do say. They do not say that only certain classes of people should be armed. They do not tie the right to hunting, sport, or government service. They do not suggest that the right disappears based on shifting political preferences. They consistently describe an armed populace as a defining feature of a free republic. They treat this condition as normal, expected, and necessary. That is the part of the Second Amendment most Americans are never taught. Today, debates about the Second Amendment often ignore this historical foundation. Arguments are framed as if the right emerged suddenly in 1791, disconnected from the broader philosophy of liberty that shaped the Constitution. That approach strips the amendment of its context and meaning. Understanding the Second Amendment requires understanding the worldview of the people who wrote it. They believe that liberty depends on structure, culture, and capability. They believe that power must be checked at multiple levels. And they believe that a free people must never be entirely dependent on the state for their own defense. This does not mean they glorified violence. It means they understood human nature, history, and the dangers of concentrated power. Their goal was not conflict, but prevention. An armed populace was one of several tools designed to keep government within its proper bounds. If more Americans read the Federalist Papers, many modern arguments would change. The conversation would become less about slogans and more about substance. It would focus less on fear and more on structure. It would recognize that the Second Amendment is not an isolated sentence, but part of a larger constitutional system. The founders did not believe rights came from government. They believed rights existed first, and government was created to secure them. That belief is woven throughout the Federalist Papers and reflected in the Bill of Rights. This is why history matters. When we lose historical context, we lose understanding. And when we lose understanding, we allow important principles to be redefined without realizing what has been lost. Most Americans were never taught this about the Second Amendment, not because it was hidden, but because it was assumed. The receipts have always been there, in black and white, waiting to be read. If we want informed discussions about liberty, rights, and government power, we have to start with the actual beliefs of the people who built the system we inherited. Only then can we have honest conversations about how those principles apply today. Understanding the past doesn't solve every modern problem, but it gives us a clearer foundation. And when it comes to the Second Amendment, that foundation is far deeper, more deliberate, and more misunderstood than most people realize.